Welcome back to the Brave Herd. Something was wrong. In the middle of a packed gymnasium, in front of hundreds of people, a military working dog suddenly stopped following commands. He lifted his nose to the air. His body went rigid. His amber eyes locked onto something across the crowded room with an intensity that made his handler's hand tighten instantly on the lead. And then, without warning, without a command, without any explanation that anyone in that room could understand, he did something that nobody had ever seen him do in 9 years of military service. He pulled free and walked away. Not frantically, not chaotically, deliberately, quietly, with a kind of calm, unshakable purpose that told everyone watching that this animal knew exactly where he was going and exactly why. Past the podium, past the mayor sitting in the front row in his pressed blue suit, past the decorated officers standing at attention near the flag, past the rows of wide-eyed children holding their miniature American flags, past every important person in that gymnasium, the crowd went completely silent. Not the polite silence of an audience waiting for the next moment. The deep, breathless silence of hundreds of people who somehow understood, without being told, that they were witnessing something they could not explain and must not interrupt. The dog stopped at the far edge of the bleachers at the feet of one quiet old man standing completely alone, an elderly gentleman in a simple gray jacket and dark jeans that nobody had spoken to all morning, a man that nobody had recognized, a man that nobody had offered a seat in the front row, a man who had driven himself here alone, and stood quietly near the back where he would not bother anyone. The dog sat down at his feet, looked up into his face, and placed one paw gently into the old man's trembling hand. The gymnasium did not make a sound. The old man looked down. His chin trembled. His weathered hand slowly, carefully closed around that paw. And in a voice so quiet that only the people standing nearest him could hear, he whispered one single word into the silence. "Rex." The dog pressed forward and rested his head gently against the old man's chest, directly over his heart, and he stayed there completely still, completely certain, as if he had been waiting his entire life to be exactly in this place. The old man closed his eyes, and 15 years of grief began to crack open from the inside. His name was Master Chief Special Warfare Operator Thomas Callahan, United States Navy, retired. Most people called him Tom. He was 63 years old. He had a silver star and a bronze star with valor sitting in a box under his bed that he never opened. He had 30 years of service in the United States Navy SEALs behind him, deployments across Afghanistan, Iraq, and places that still do not appear on any declassified document. He had operated in the darkest and most dangerous corners of the world's most brutal conflicts, and he had done it with a steadiness and a quiet courage that his teammates still spoke about in hushed and reverent tones decades later. Thomas Callahan had been the kind of man that other exceptional men looked toward when everything was falling apart. But nobody in that gymnasium knew any of that. To them, he was simply a quiet, elderly man who had shown up alone and stood near the back. He had almost not come at all. He had sat on the edge of his bed that morning for a long time, the way he did most mornings now, in the particular heavy silence of a house that used to hold more life than it currently did. His wife Margaret had passed away 3 years ago after a sickness that moved faster than anyone had prepared for. She had waited for him through 3 decades of deployments with a grace and a patience that had humbled him every single day of their marriage. When she left, the house became something different. The silence became something with weight to it, something that pressed against him in the long hours between midnight and morning when the nightmares came, and there was nobody beside him anymore to remind him that he had made a home. Most days he managed. He made his coffee. He took his walks. He kept himself together the way 30 years of military discipline teaches a man to keep himself together, even when keeping himself together is the hardest thing he has ever done. But some mornings the weight was heavier than others. And this particular morning, Veterans Day, had been one of the heaviest in a long time because Veterans Day always brought Rex back. 15 years ago in the mountains outside Kandahar, Afghanistan, Tom Callahan and his K-9 partner Rex were moving through a suspected insurgent compound at 3 o'clock in the morning on a classified mission that would never appear in any newspaper or any public record. The air was cold and thin the way air in Afghanistan always is at that hour. Tom moved through the structure with Rex beside him, the way they had moved together through dozens of operations across 4 years of partnership, For years of deserts and mountains and darkness and danger. For years of sleeping side by side in forward operating bases, sharing water, eating whatever was available, keeping each other alive in places that were specifically designed to kill them both. Rex was not Tom's dog. Rex was Tom's partner, his brother, the truest and most honest relationship Tom Callahan had known in 30 years of service. Because a dog cannot deceive you, and a dog does not love you for anything you can provide. He loves you because you are you completely and without condition and without reservation, and without ever once asking for anything in return except your presence. Rex had loved Thomas Callahan with every fiber of his loyal and extraordinary heart from the first day they were partnered together, and Tom had loved him back with a depth that surprised him. A man who had always kept most things carefully behind a wall. They had been clearing the compound hallway by hallway, room by room, the way they had done it 100 times before when the explosion happened. There was no warning. There never is. One moment Tom was moving through a darkened corridor with Rex at his left side. The next moment the world became heat and pressure, and a sound so enormous it became no sound at all. And then there was nothing. He woke up in a military hospital in Tulle, Germany 4 days later. Broken ribs, ruptured hearing in his left ear, shrapnel embedded across his back and left shoulder that surgeons had spent hours removing. He lay in that hospital bed and looked at the ceiling. And the first thing he did before asking about his injuries, before asking what had happened, before asking anything about himself at all, was speak. And the words he chose in that moment told you everything about who Thomas Callahan truly was beneath the medals and the missions and the carefully. Maintain composure. He asked about Rex. The nurse beside his bed went quiet. She looked down at her clipboard. She looked back at him, and she said 4 words that would follow Thomas Callahan like a shadow for the next 15 years of his life. "We're sorry, Master Chief." He did not speak after that for a very long time. He turned his face toward the window and looked at the gray German sky outside. He did not cry because men like Thomas Callahan had spent 30 years learning to carry grief without setting it down in front of anyone. But something inside him went quiet in a way that never fully came back. He had survived things across 3 decades that should have ended him a dozen times. He had carried the names of lost teammates like stones in his chest for years. But losing Rex broke something in Thomas Callahan that 30 years of war had never managed to break, because Rex had never chosen any of this. Rex had simply loved him completely. And Tom believed in the deepest and most unforgiving part of himself that he had failed the one friend who had never once failed him. He retired 6 months later and came home to Chesapeake, Virginia, to Margaret and the quiet house on the quiet street. And every single night, without exception, before he allowed himself to sleep, he opened the drawer of his bedside table and removed a small piece of folded cloth. Inside it was a dog collar, brown leather, worn smooth in places with small scratches along the buckle that Tom could trace from memory in complete darkness. Rex's collar. He had asked for it before leaving Germany, and someone had found it in the compound wreckage and brought it to him without asking why. Every night for 15 years, Thomas Callahan held that collar in both hands, ran his thumb slowly along those familiar scratches, and whispered the same words into the darkness of his empty bedroom. "I'm sorry, buddy. I'm so sorry I left you." He had whispered it the night before this Veterans Day. He had held that collar for a long time in the dark, longer than usual, feeling the particular loneliness of man who has outlasted most of the things that made his life feel full. And some quiet instinct he could not name, had made him get up in the morning and drive himself to Harrove Elementary School and stand near the bleachers, where nobody would bother him, and watch the children with their flags and their handmade signs. He had not expected anything. He had simply needed to be somewhere that morning that was not that silent house. He had not expected Rex. Now across the gymnasium, Staff Sergeant Daniel Ortega stepped forward slowly. He had been Rex's handler for 11 years. He had worked alongside this dog through 2 overseas deployments, through hundreds of training exercises, through everything a military working dog and his handler go through together. In 11 years, he had never once seen Rex break formation without a command. He had never seen Rex move toward a stranger with that particular quality of recognition, that absolute certainty, that complete and unshakable knowing. His voice, when he spoke, was not entirely steady. He told Tom that Rex had been pulled from the rubble of that compound, alive, badly injured, barely breathing, but alive. He had been evacuated to a military veterinary facility and had spent months recovering from injuries that should have killed him. But the records from that night had been lost in the chaos of a multi-unit operation gone wrong. In the confusion, someone had entered incorrect information into the wrong file, and the error had never been discovered and never been corrected. Rex had recovered. He had returned to service. He had deployed twice more and performed with the same excellence he had always shown. But in 11 years, he had never fully bonded with another handler the way military working dogs bond. When they find the person they belong to, he had always been professional, always obedient, always done exactly what was asked of him. But he had always kept some quiet part of himself somewhere else, as if he was waiting for something that nobody around him could see or understand, as if he simply knew in whatever way dogs know the things they know, that his person was still out there somewhere. Tom listened to every word without speaking. He stood with Rex's head pressed warm and steady against his chest, and one hand resting along the dog's neck. And he listened. And as he listened, 15 years of guilt, 15 years of whispered apologies into an empty bedroom, 15 years of a man who believed he had abandoned the truest friend he had ever known began to come apart from the inside all at once. His knees gave out, not slowly, not with any kind of dignity or control. They simply stopped holding him the way knees do when a body has been carrying something too heavy for too long, and finally mercifully is allowed to put it down. Thomas Callahan, Silver Star recipient, 30-year Navy SEAL, a man who had remained standing in the face of things that would have ended most human beings, sank to both knees on the polished gymnasium floor. He wrapped both arms around Rex and pulled him close and buried his face deep in the dog's warm fur, and he wept. Not quietly, not with the careful, controlled grief of a man managing his emotions. He wept the way a person weeps when 15 years of carried sorrow finally finds a way out. His shoulders shook. His breath came in broken waves. His tears disappeared into Rex's fur, and Rex did not move, did not pull back, did not make a sound. He simply pressed closer, warm and solid and absolutely present. Often the only thing it ever had to give, and the only thing Tom had ever truly needed, his complete, unconditional, unbreakable presence. The little girl in the front row, who had asked her teacher if the dog was a soldier, was crying without fully understanding why. Parents in the bleachers had stopped filming. Veterans sitting near the front had turned their faces away, not because they were unmoved, but because they were moved too deeply. The mayor sat with his folded remarks in his lap and did not reach for them. The gymnasium held hundreds of people, and it was as silent as a chapel. Tom pressed his face against Rex's neck and said 3 words. 3 words that the people nearest him would carry with them for the rest of their lives. I never left. Rex pressed closer still. 6 weeks later, Rex was officially retired from United States military service with full honors at a small ceremony attended by his unit and his handlers and one 63-year-old man in a simple gray jacket, who this time stood in the very front row. Rex did not go to a new facility. He was not reassigned. He went home to a modest house on a quiet street in Chesapeake, Virginia, where a worn leather collar that had spent 15 years in a bedside drawer was finally peacefully no longer needed as a substitute for the real thing. That night, Thomas Callahan slept through the night for the first time in 15 years. No nightmares pulling him back to dark hallways in Afghanistan. No guilt pressing against his chest in the small hours of the morning. No whispered apologies into the darkness of an empty room. Just the slow and steady breathing of a dog curled warm at the foot of his bed, real and present and exactly where it always belonged. In the morning, Tom opened his eyes and lay still for a long moment, listening to that breathing, feeling something settle in his chest that it took him a moment to name, because it had been so long since he had felt it. Keith! He reached his hand down. Rex lifted his head. Their eyes met the way they always had, the way they had met in dark hallways in Kandahar and in a hospital room in Germany and in a silent gymnasium full of people who would never forget what they witnessed, with the recognition of 2 souls who found each other once and never, despite everything the world placed between them, truly let go. Tom whispered 2 words into quiet morning light. Welcome home. And that is what this story leaves us with today. Loyalty is not something that time dissolves. It is not something that distance weakens or that war destroys or that 15 years of silence can finally extinguish. Some bonds are built deeper than circumstance. Some connections survive things that should have ended them because they were never built on anything fragile. Rex waited without being told to wait. He simply could not stop. Tom held that collar without being told to hold on. He simply could not let go. That is not just a story about a soldier and his dog. That is a story about what love looks like when it refuses to give up. And that is a story worth honoring. If this story moves something inside you today, then you already know why this channel exists. State of Valor is here for the warriors who stood quietly near the back while the world moved past them, for the bonds that survived war and separation and 15 years of silence, for every veteran and every K-9 partner who served this nation and deserved to be remembered. If that matters to you, subscribe to State of Valor right now and ring that notification bell so you never miss a single story. Share this video with someone who loves his country, someone who has served, someone who has lost, or someone who simply needs to be reminded today that some things in this world are worth holding on to no matter what the cost. No warrior ever truly walks alone. No loyal heart is ever truly lost.